President's Day, the holiday in which we celebrate our nation's leaders. And the good ones, anyway. Now, this President's Day, I just wanted to make a simple video for you guys where I discuss some of the most interesting and, in my opinion, fascinating presidents who I want to talk about. Anyway, let's get to it. Starting off, I want to talk about John Adams. Now, John Adams is such a fascinating figure to me, as before the Revolution, he was a lawyer who had defended the British soldiers during the Boston Massacre, and he went on to serve in the Continental Congress as an ambassador to France, Holland, and Great Britain, where he actually met King George III, before eventually serving as our first vice president and then second president. Now, Adams has tended to get somewhat of a bad rap in history because at the time he was in office, we had rising political tensions, which I think he unfairly gets blamed for. He was also dealing with the quasi-war and rising tensions between France and Britain. And while he was in office, though, he ended up signing into law the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were not good laws and he should not have signed into law. But I also think he gets unfairly blamed as if he was actively supporting and trying to, push for these laws. He wasn't necessarily the big supporter of them, but he did support them and sign them into law. Now, Adams, though, did amazing in his handling of the quasi-war and managed to prevent the United States from going to war. He went to Congress. He slowly started trying to build up our Navy and Army in the event that we went to war, but he did not push for it, and he did not unduly try to create the circumstance that would create one. He ended up really just trying to get a peaceful solution to it, and he does end up signing a treaty with France that, in my opinion, does do that, and I think he deserves more credit for it. Now, the second president that I wanted to talk about was Zachary Taylor, who was our 12th president from 1849 through to 1850. Taylor, before being president, had been a military man, never held elected office, and he served in several wars, most remembered the Mexican-American War for his actions at Palo Alto, Saco de Palma, and the Battle of Monterey. Now, Taylor is interesting because he was a Southern slaveholder who got elected president as a Whig, and he ends up, though, not supporting the Compromise of 1850, and he doesn't want to see the expansion of slavery, which was just very untypical for that time, especially for a Southern president. And it's very likely Taylor may have ended up vetoing that compromise, but it's hard to say because he ended up dying in July of 1850. Now, there were rumors that Taylor was poisoned, and those aren't true. They ended up doing an autopsy of his body many years later, and they just didn't find any evidence of it. But he's so interesting because Taylor is one of the general presidents, serving in the military. And there's often this idea that, oh, well, he was in the military, so obviously he's going to have that national view as a general, and since he was an officer, he'll obviously stick with the Union. But that's not necessarily true. Taylor is really an exception in that, when you consider Robert E. Lee was a career military man, and so were many of these Confederate officers who would end up joining the Confederacy, which I think makes Taylor all the more special. Taylor was ready to fight with his son-in-law, Jefferson Davis, yes, that Jefferson Davis, during this crisis, and I really think had Taylor stayed in office and not died, that we may have been able to prevent the Civil War, or at least it wouldn't have been as bad to what it became. Now, Franklin Pierce is the president who I have the most problems with. Pierce was a doughface who had been a senator from New Hampshire. He had served in the New Hampshire legislature, and Pierce, in my opinion, was not a very good president. He's not a very good president to most historians. He typically ranks towards the bottom, because his actions helped ensure that we would go on to the Civil War when he signed into law the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he supported many of the slavers in these debates of the slave debate. Now, Pierce was most likely not mentally stable when he was in office. He saw his son shortly before he got into office get decapitated in front of him in a train accident that was right in front of him and his wife ended up hating him and blaming him for it. She thought that it was punishment from God for her husband seeking higher office, and she mourned. She didn't go into public events. It was a very tense time. Then Pierce had to deal with the death of his vice president not long after he took office, William King, and that didn't put him on a good path. So Pierce was easily able to be bullied into doing many things, and he did support many of these things that he was doing as well. Pierce would end up dying alone in 1869, and when I say alone, I do mean alone. He had no one by his side. His wife was dead, many of his friends were dead, and he just isn't remembered as a very good president for that. Next up is James Garfield, who I have already discussed in depth in some of my other videos, but I just love Garfield. I think he had the most potential of any of the Gilded Age presidents. He was incredibly intelligent. He fought corruption. He cared about civil rights. He really was doing pretty well when he first got into office. I mean, he is in this massive fight with Roscoe Conkling and his own vice president, and he ends up winning that fight against Conkling, who resigns his Senate seat, doesn't get reelected to his Senate seat, and then just slowly starts to lose power before becoming irrelevant and dying. He is so amazing to me. I think really had Garfield lived, he would have been able to do so much. Sadly, he gets shot in July by Charles J. Guiteau and ends up languishing for months until eventually he dies in September of 1881 and gets succeeded by his vice president, Chester A. Arthur. Speaking of Chester Arthur is such a fascinating figure to me because before his time in office, he is incredibly corrupt as the Port Collector of New York and serving as Roscoe Conkling's lieutenant and just a henchman in his power organizations. What makes him so interesting is the fact that he gets elected vice president. Alright? Good. Okay. He's fighting with Garfield. But then Garfield gets shot. And something inside of Arthur starts to change. Very slowly, but very surely. And we see this over the course of Garfield's path to his eventual death, that Arthur is mortified. He doesn't really know what to do. He's crying over Garfield. He's not trying to take power, despite the fact that James G. Blaine said, you should come over, try and take over things until, Garfield gets better, start executing executive authority. But eventually what ends up happening is Garfield dies, Arthur takes over, and we really start to see that change continuing. Now there's an incident where Arthur is sitting in a temporary office with some of his friends, and they come in and they put their feet up on the desk and they call him Chet, and he says, get your feet off the desk and call me Mr. President. And you see that change that's just so strange. You see Arthur end up fighting for things like civil service reform. He is trying to veto bills or at least get better versions of bad bills to fight against. And you see him taking seriously the office of president that had he been VP or president under any other time, he wouldn't have. Now, Arthur, he didn't have a political base because reformists didn't trust him. Democrats obviously didn't like him. And his own faction that he came from, the Stalwarts, they thought him a traitor. So Garfield serves his time in office admirably. He really should have been a failure of a president, but he comes out looking like a solid C, having executed well his duties, and he ends up leaving office in 1885 and dies less than 2 years later. But I think overall, Chester Arthur proved to be a competent administrator who served his office well. Hey guys, thanks for watching this video. This was a fun one to make with President's Day coming up. I just really love talking about the presidents, if y'all can't tell by my videos. So please don't forget to like and subscribe, and have a good day.